Well, good morning and happy Greenbuild. Welcome to Philadelphia. I wanted just to set the scene a little bit for you. For those of you who recall last year, right here at Greenbuild, we had in our hearts the folks from the Northeast who had just experienced Superstorm Sandy. It weighed heavy on us. This year, again, we have the folks from the Philippines that we're thinking about in terms of their recovery and their rebuilding. The folks from the Midwest, Washington, Illinois, if you saw the picture on the cover of the USA Today, how the storms swept right through and destroyed homes and houses. This session is really about how do we respond to these disasters? How do we respond to these escalating extreme weather, more frequent disasters, storms, floods? And every community in the nation is vulnerable. All of us are at risk. So how do we respond? How do we build a more resilient nation? And we're lucky to have three experts, three folks who are putting this resilience agenda into action. So I want to just introduce them briefly and jump in with some questions. We have Mayor Dixon with Greensburg, Kansas, who really does understand what it means to recover and rebuild, not just bounce back, but bounce forward. And I'm going to let him tell a story in a second. We have Major General Warren Edwards, who's with a wonderful organization. CARI is the acronym, Community and Regional Resilience Institute. We also have Jon Powers, who, when the President Obama needed somebody to run sustainability for the federal government, he tapped Jon Powers. So I want to, as recovery and rebuilding is in our minds right now, we talk a lot about that. Fortunately, for all of us, I hope, we haven't had to experience that. But Mayor Dixon and his community has had to experience that. When a tornado hit Greensburg, Kansas in 2007, 95% of the buildings were wiped out. And amid that anguish and despair, they were able to bounce back. And so I wanted to turn to you, Mayor, to talk a little bit about your story, talk about the experience that you guys went through, and how did you rally around resilience and sustainability?
We in this country have a real longing to have a sense of community. And that's one thing in our small rural community we had. We had that infrastructure based around the school, around nonprofits, and just churches, and everybody just worked together. So immediately after the tornado, it wasn't about me. It was about, hey, is my neighbor okay? Hey, I wonder if the other side of town's okay. And in the midst of that devastation, mattered not your social economic status, we were all homeless in just a matter of minutes. But the true, resilient, most sustainable thing we have in life was our relationships with each other. So that cultivation of those relationships post-disaster is so important, or pre-disaster is so important post-disaster. And that's what really got us going. Where we lost everything. We had a huge circus tent put up on the east edge of town, and we did everything in that tent from hug together, cry together, laugh together, to community planning, sustainable master plan, long-term recovery plan. We had community church services together. That's what draws a community together. And everything else will follow from there by bringing in great resources like USGBC, federal and state agencies. But always remember, federal and state agencies are not there to come and make you whole. You're not entitled to anything post-disaster. What you are entitled to is the opportunity to achieve, which means you have to walk hand in hand with those agencies that are there to help you. But it has to be your plan. It can't be someone else's plan. So I just encourage all of us in everything we're doing that's how we recover. Every community in the United States right now, Jason, is in the midst of a disaster. Whether it's a financial disaster, whether it's an infrastructure disaster, whether it's crime, whatever it is, you have to decide you're going to deal with it. And we as a community made that decision. We were not going to pack up our tents and leave. We were going to stay, and we were going to rebuild, and we were going to rebuild in a better, stronger, greener manner?
Well, Greensburg has been an inspiration to so many of us. I think it's been a global model for how do you build back stronger, smarter, and greener. I want to turn to you, Warren. We talked a little bit now about rebuilding and recovery. So much of what we need to do is kind of create this culture of preparedness and inculcate the idea that preparedness pays back. I think that with the green building, one of the reasons we've been so successful is one, we've set a standard and we've overcome the hurdles as it relates to metrics and indicators and measurements, but we've also made the business case. And we've explained to folks that, hey, you're going to save money. And some studies have already shown that for every dollar you spend on preparedness, society saves $4. But in your experience, how do we get this idea across? How do we get preparedness and resilience to take root? You've been doing this for a long time, working with a lot of communities. Tell us a little bit about what we do pre-disaster. How do we bake this in?
Well, Jason, that's an extremely important part. I was listening to the mayor and thinking how much I agreed with everything he said about how one has to build those capacities or how those capacities of social coherence and trust come together after a disaster. And that's what's so necessary to bring a community back, having a sense of community. But you know, doing that in Greensburg, Kansas is one thing. Doing that in Philadelphia or San Francisco or a major city or a larger metropolis is kind of a different issue. And we've probably got to go about it using some of the same skills. But what we really have to do is figure out how do we do this before the disaster. The time to bond with your neighbors is not when the house is blown down and the flood is gone. The time to build your continuity plans for your business is not after the flood has come or the building. It's done ahead of time. And so how do we induce our communities to do really hard things, to take on that hard work of becoming prepared before the disaster happens? Now, I've said to you before, one of the things we've seen as we go around and talk to, and no reflection, Mr. Mayor, but to mayors and business people around, if I look at them and say, look, I can absolutely assure you that there's a 30% chance that your community will suffer a devastating catastrophe sometime in the next 100 years. Gosh, the only thing that they hear me say is probably won't happen while I'm the mayor. You know, probably won't happen while I'm the business guy. You know, I've got a 70% chance of missing this thing. So taking on this business of preparedness, of building that social, of building those continuity plans, of figuring out where the dollars are going to come from to rebuild that community before the disaster happens, is something that's just not inherently something we do. And we can't scare people into it. We keep telling people how the climate is changing, how disasters are getting worse, how we're positioning ourselves so that any kind of catastrophe impacts us worse. But in fact, this is hard business of getting my community together, of making those investments, of creating those things that are necessary ahead of time. And I would maintain that the problem we have is if you can't scare people into this, you have to make a business case. You have to say it is good business to become a resilient community whether or not you ever have a disaster. If you take those steps that are so necessary to you after the disaster, then in fact you're going to build social capital before the disaster. And that social capital is going to pay off because you're going to become a place that people want to live. You're going to become a place where people are not moving from, but people are moving into. You're going to become a place where businesses want to come and invest because that's where their people want to live and work. You could even make the case that if we were to do this right, much as U.S. Green Building Council has done with its LEED program, if we were to do this right, we would even begin to think about certifying communities as being resilient against some agreed on scale that stakeholders that had come together, and we would be able to say that you're a bronze resilient community or a gold resilient community, and that would begin to have effects beyond just building social capital. Perhaps it would influence an investment decision. I want to invest in that city versus that one because I know they're resilient. They have proven that they're resilient. I want to treat them differently as an insurance company. based, because I know that they've built business continuity plans, that they enforce building codes, they do things like that. So I think that's
so they
a
get
business.
A break and they get financial incentives.
I think that's the
do
business
this work.
case we have to make to get people to prepare ahead of time, so that we have those things in place when the disaster.
Well, I know you have a pilot that has created a framework for resilient communities, and I want you to talk about that in a bit, but and get into some more detail, because you're doing that in what, how many 8 cities?
Number of communities across the nation. Yeah.
To talk about that a little bit later, because that really is important in giving people the blueprint for what success looks like. I want to just turn to John, because one of the things that I've seen since in the last 3 or 4 years that I think is extremely helpful is we've had policymakers at every level of government, a full constellation of leadership is what I would say, from President Obama to our governors, Governor O'Malley, who I was with yesterday. He was first governor in the nation to do an executive order on resilience. President Obama has done 2 executive orders on resilience now, and he's got his National Climate Action Plan. And talk a little bit about what the administration is doing and your work to coordinate across all 26 federal agencies and departments, and then be a strong federal partner to states and local communities.
Right. It's a great question. First of all, thank you so much for hosting us, and thanks to the Greenbuild community. This is a really amazing conversation and a necessary conversation. I come from a small town in upstate New York, and I see what the mayor has gone through in Kansas, and I think you're exactly right. It's that social network of folks, not social network in terms of online, social network in terms of a community that really will help keep the bonds together. So the president understands these issues, and as Jason mentioned, in June gave a monumental speech on climate change. And the reason it's monumental, I believe, is because he launched a climate action plan. If you care about these issues, I challenge you to go read that, because in the plan he calls on us to do 3 things. One is cutting carbon pollution, and there's efforts around that both from EPA rules, but also renewable energy projects, efforts around green buildings. There's resilience and preparation, which is, I think, for the first time really beginning to rise up as a conversation that we need to be having in our communities. And third is sort of on the international front and reestablishing our leadership in that space. I think the folks here at Greenbuild and the USGBC represent all of that, which I find really interesting. But in the resilience piece specifically, this isn't coming out of the blue. This is building off a track record of what the federal government has been doing in this space for several years. But what we're doing now is we're bringing it together under sort of a common thread. So, for instance, this year, for the first time, agencies have done and published climate adaptation plans. Those were published in January, each agency. And this is our first effort at this. So in many agencies, they're discovering how to bring together folks that manage their buildings or the folks that manage their missions and talk through what effects climate change are going to have on those missions. So as we look to go forward and continue building on this, now we're asking our agencies to not just focus on what you're doing in your installation, your VA hospital or your military base, but what's happening in your community. Because unless we're part of that fabric, and the VA hospital is ready to operate in case there's a storm, we need to be part of that broader dialogue. And so we're trying to push those things forward. And on top of that, the President's asked for the federal government to look at all their resources, and they're putting together a toolkit for folks like the mayor so that when his staff at the city level may not have the resources to go evaluate all the science that's out there or go evaluate all the toolkits that are out there. So we will begin to put together a central hub of the things that are needed in terms of those tools, and we'll figure out more of what's needed by engaging with a task force that the President launched just about 10 days ago, which the mayor is part of. Mayor Nutter here in Philadelphia is part of. And it's a group of mayors and governors and local leaders and tribal leaders who are providing recommendations to the administration on what they need, so we can try to address those needs in a way that's helpful for them.
Thanks, John. One of the things that I've said about resilience is I think this is an agenda that we have a unique chance to hit the ground running. And one of the reasons I believe that is because there is such a synergy between what we're already doing, what we're already prescribing as it relates to the sustainability agenda. We see it so clearly in green building. Dr. Chris Pike of the GBC put out a report with the University of Michigan last summer that went through the LEED green building rating system, went through green building best practices, and showed how they helped advance resiliency outcomes. And we've now a tool that's available for project teams that shows very, very specifically how each rating system advances climate resilience. And that's a big first step for us from the building standpoint. But this synergies in solutions, if you will, on the sustainability and resiliency side, I think is so important because, you know, this agenda can be overwhelming. And how do we make sure that we are advancing the solution? So I want to put a question to really everybody, but tell us a little bit about how, and I'll start with you, Mayor, how, you know, the sustainability, John, you said the word fabric. And I kind of think of this as we have all these different threads, and sustainability and resiliency are two major threads, and they're not, you know, they weave together. So how do we think of these things in a coherent and coordinated and complementary way?
Well, I think the one thing that we really got to concentrate on when we talk about sustainability and resilience and green and all those things that give us the capacity to endure as a society, to continue in existence, is it has to transcend politics. And the problem we've had in this country is we want to make everything political. I had a gentleman...
Amen.
I had a
having to be on it, working the Washington, D.C. Amen.
I had a gentleman here several years ago that said, Bob, I don't understand how a small community in the middle of nowhere would even think about rebuilding after being totally devastated. And I said, well, sir, you got two things wrong. Number one is it's our home. And number two is we're not in the middle of nowhere. We're in the middle of everywhere. And no matter where you're from, you're in the middle of everywhere. It's your community. Be informed, involved, and engaged. That's what resiliency is, and that's what sustainability is. Right. The other issue, without taking time from the other two gentlemen, is simply you have to decide, are you an owner of your community or are you a renter? Are we an owner of your state or are you a renter? Are you an owner of your country or are you a renter of the United States? Owner's mentality says, I invest and I take care in this. I am active in the process. Absolutely. A renter's mentality is someone else will take care of it. If the pipe's leaking or the toilet's got a problem, I just call somebody and they come and take care of it. That mentality is not sustainable, is not resilient, and will not endure for future generations.
Warren, you've seen this on the ground, and if you have a framework for community-wide resilience. Talk a little bit how sustainability plays a part.
You know, it's an interesting discussion and one that the academic circles have had for some time about sustainability versus resilience and how those two things come together. I'm not smart enough to get in that discussion. We'll leave that to the academics. I don't see them in conflict, and I see them as very supportive of each other. But you know, when you get down on the ground and you talk to actual communities and mayors and business owners, they're not interested in definitions. They're not interested in knowing what the precise definition of resilience is. What they want to know is, what does it mean for my town? How can you describe to me what my town looks like if it's a resilient town? And if I can understand that, if I can kind of know what I would look like if I were a resilient community, how would I measure that? How would I assess myself to know if I am or if I'm not? And I don't mean that I'm 98.6% resilient or 42% resilient, but I'm a lot resilient or I'm not, or I am in some areas or I'm not in other areas. They're the practical things they want to know. And then what they really want to know is, okay, if I can do an assessment that helps me understand that I am or I'm not, or I am in some areas and I'm not in others, can you give me some help, some processes and tools, some things that I can use practically in my community? I don't have the dollars to go out and bring in high-priced consultants to do this for me. I don't have the dollars to go out and bring in big risk management tools. So can you give me something that I can use in myself to bring my whole community together to figure out how to become resilient. And then it kind of gets to my earlier point, and then how do I get rewarded for this? You know, if I'm going to put all of this time and effort in it, I'd like to get something out of it. And so how do I do that? So to some extent, as we have looked around the country, we've really seen a demand for just that, an ability to understand what resilience is, some way to assess it. Measure's hard. We get back in those academic circles again. If we're going to really try to, because there's things that we can measure easily, but there are things like leadership, cohesiveness, stickiness,
courage.
Courage. There are those kinds of things that are more difficult to measure. So how can I assess it, and then how can I work my way to become that? And that's been our interest over this time.
Do you mind if I build out the general's point? I think one of the things, and he talks about the academic piece, but how this plays into the broader policy conversation, and why I think this is really important in the current state we're in, as we're talking about resilience, for instance, even at the White House. And for the folks that don't know how the White House works, there's different councils that advise the president, right? So I sit at the Council on Environmental Equality, and there's the Council on Economic Advisors, and the Council on Domestic Policy Council, and then there's the National Security Council, for instance, right? And if you talk to the National Security Council previously about what resilience was, they thought it was guns, guards, and gates, right? We'll have guns, guards, and gates, and we'll protect our bases. But if you start talking to them about what happens when a storm comes through, or what happens if there's a flood and there's no more gates, you know, in that education, in that conversation over the course of the last 18 months or 2 years in the administration, folks have begun to recognize this and found ways to build that resilience more broadly. But it's taken a lot of dialogue. And hit on what the mayor said is, this is, when you get down to it, it's about, it gets personal. So getting into your hometown and what people are going to face on the shorelines in New Jersey and Delaware or here in Pennsylvania is different what they're going to face in Colorado, where they're having droughts and wildfires. Right. So, do you mind if I show?
Yeah, and just to build on what you're saying, I mean, I want to make the point that resilience has to be a big tent effort, and there needs to, and I think it is, and we're bringing new people to the fold to be part of the conversation, and one of the constituencies, if you will, being the military and folks who understand these security issues,
right.
And they understand logistics, they understand mobilization. And they know how to get these things done. And I think that you've done a great job, just to give you a little bit of kudos here, you've done a great job of bringing those folks together. Your event down in Norfolk is an example of that. And I think you have a video of this.
And just to tee up this video about setting up, the President's asked us as a federal government to lead by example in the areas of energy and sustainability. So one of those areas is, as we've been doing this climate adaptation planning, for instance, what we've recognized is unless we can, as a federal facility, do all the planning we want. But if we're not engaged in the community, we're not getting what we need into the broader fabric. So we did an event down in Hampton Roads, and to set up Hampton Roads, there's 5 military bases down there. It's the largest economic engine. And as the general told me on the way previously, it's got more federal employees by percentage of the workforce than anywhere in the country. Tremendous amount of military families. So we did a town hall event down there with a 3-star admiral from the Navy, some local planners, and an IMAX theater. And if anyone knows the military, they love their PowerPoints. And we did PowerPoints on this huge IMAX screen, which was fascinating. So if there's a chance, we can show this video.
Back with the story new at 11. It displaces millions of people, wiping out food supplies and making natural disasters worse. Now climate change is considered a growing threat to national security.
The Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Energy and Environmental Readiness was among the active and retired military commanders leading a town discussion on this topic in downtown Norfolk. And 10 on your side's Art Kahn was at that meeting. And Art, we think about climate change, and national security usually does not come to mind.
Yeah, I would agree, Tom, but as I found out tonight, climate change can affect national security in a number of ways, both directly and indirectly. Either way, its effects on this region as it pertains to national security will be noticeable.
The Hampton Roads region is no stranger to severe storms. None of those storms are, in and of themselves, evidence of climate change, however.
No single weather event can be directly attributed to climate change. We do know that climate change is fueling more frequent extreme weather events.
Those extreme weather events often lead to the need for assistance from Hampton Roads-based military units.
So we have to have those capabilities to be there to help respond and work with the United Nations, work with other agencies, other countries to do that.
More frequent and more extreme storms are not the only products of climate change. Rising sea level can also be attributed to this phenomenon. Rising sea level poses a significant long-term threat to Naval Station Norfolk and other military installations in our region.
It is accelerating, and it is affecting Hampton Roads more than the global mean.
Captain Joe Bouchard once commanded Naval Station Norfolk. The rising sea level will challenge more than the construction of the naval piers in Norfolk. Langley Air Force Base is also dealing with unprecedented flooding during heavy storms.
Langley floods much more often than it ever did.
Flooding at the shipyards is threatening the area's industrial portion of the defense dollar, and the forecast isn't too encouraging.
If you flood a dry dock with a carrier in it, you have very serious problems. And the climate studies, the sea level rise studies, show that what used to be the 100-year storm is now the 30-year storm, and there are forecasts that it could be like the 13-year storm.
Yeah, and Captain Bouchard said the only military installation in Hampton Roads not threatened by sea level rise is Oceana, joking that that was threatened by BRAC. It's also worth noting that the only city threatened more by a rapid rise in sea level other than Norfolk is New Orleans. Art Khan, 10 on your side.
So what's important about that is, that naval facility can raise its docks for the aircraft carriers to come into. They can move their substations. But if they don't work with the community to figure out what's going to happen to the gas station or what's going to happen to the grocery store, the Marines, they'll never be able to get to work. So we won't be able to complete our missions. And so that's a conversation that's happening in Hampton Roads. But that same conversation has to happen in places like Iowa, where you have to bring in the agriculture community and other key parts of the industry to talk about the effects that are happening there, and the effects, for instance, that the role that our VA hospitals can play in that community, for instance, and ensuring that the generators are no longer in the basement in case there's floods, or how they're going to deal with significant drought. So we're trying to drive that conversation around the country, and the President's recent executive order that was out 10 days ago is about really trying to push that conversation out into folks' homes. Not their homes, but their communities. So, we look forward to having opportunities to do more of that in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the military branches have done a lot of work in this area, and again, it's another reason why we can hit the ground running. At USGBC, we have the saying that every building is a story about people, and in resilience, our organization and some of the groups that we work closely with on advancing some of the solutions, we often talk about the bricks and mortar. But I think a theme that I've heard already from you guys is that it's all about the people. And this idea of social resilience is, I think, so important. Eric Kleinenberg has done a lot of work in this area. Others have done some work and showed how social capital and social connectedness is vital if we're going to be able to be prepared and resilient to these risks and vulnerabilities. And so, I turn it over to again, all three of you. One of the things that I remember, somebody who was an absolute expert on this told me, he goes, when it comes down to it, if a disaster hits or if a certain storm hits, your chances of survival, your ability to withstand the storm is really one of the most important variables, is how well you know your neighbor. Think about that. This is about people. So in that regard, and there's another issue in this social resilience. They often say that the people are most vulnerable are the ones who are going to be are at the most risk. So how do we make sure that there's an equitable solution, that we're thinking about the entire community? Major General, you have a saying that you say, if you have problems as a community, whatever they may be, whether they're energy problems, whether they're economic problems, whether they're social problems, when a disaster hits, those problems just get worse. And so talk about the social resilience, people as part of the solution, and engaging and empowering the community.
One of America's strengths is it really does have great mayors. One of those great mayors is down in Charleston, South Carolina, a guy by the name of Joe Riley. He's been around for a long time. And that quote is actually Joe Riley's, and he says that disasters, whether natural or man-made, accelerate trends in progress. And so if the trend is upward, then there's a good possibility that after that disaster, the trend is going to continue upward because you had a plan. You had a plan that for fixing that problem, whatever that problem was, and in some cases a disaster can help you even fix that problem. If you've got a land use problem, but you've got a plan for how you're going to fix your land use problem, and the tornado blows everything down in that land you didn't want it on, that pretty well helps you fix that problem. But in fact, most of the challenges we face are only going to get worse. The mayor said we're in disaster. Every city's in disaster every day. Isn't that what you said? And we agree. There are a number of chronic problems that face it. Cities are facing lots of challenges today. They're facing change at unprecedented speeds. We're facing new spectrum of risk we've talked about today, whether it's from climate change or terrorism or whatever it comes from. We're not yet out of the effects of the greatest recession that most of us have seen. Our demographics are changing significantly, then we're going to have to deal with all of that. So there's lots of threats out there. What communities have to do is figure out how to bring everybody together, how to mobilize that entire community around the challenges that it faces, not just the storms, not just the climate change, but all of those challenges it faces every day to build a stronger, more resilient community. Government can't do it alone. The private business sector can't do it alone. I sort of divide communities now into three groups. Nothing scientific in this. It's probably even wrong. But the three groups that I divide into are, there's the government, there's the private business sector, and then there's all the rest of us. And all the rest of us are extremely important. The churches, the civic associations, the United Way, the Red, all of those other things that aren't governmental or private business sector that are out there are so critical. And the interesting thing is when you try to build a resilience effort in your community, they're the people you can most easily get involved. But they are also the people with the least power to get things done. So we've got to figure out how to harness the government and their powers, the private business sector and their resources, with all of those great civic actors down there in one whole community to come together to take these challenges on.
That's a great point. I think the Obama administration is really leaning on state and local leaders and encouraging their input. Can you talk a little bit about the task force that was created?
Yeah, absolutely.
John?
So that's sort of the intent of the task force is that, and the mayor said it backstage, the federal government's great in bringing together a lot of the technical resources that may be helpful in an emergency, but when push comes to shove, this is about rebuilding your home. So the community needs to be a critical part of that dialogue. So the president recognized this and did a significant amount of outreach to bring together a great group of governors, mayors, state and local leaders, tribal leaders, to help educate us as the federal community and what they need in this space. And so they are meeting for the first time in the next month or so, and over the course of the next year, going to be working on putting together a series of recommendations to help tell us where we need to be going in some of those spaces. We have an equally powerful organization within the federal community where we've brought together agency heads on a task force that is having a very similar dialogue, because obviously the issues around the State Department, issues around the Defense Department, issues around EPA or DOE are different when you have to deal with climate change. So we want to continue to address those broad issues as well. One of the things I think is really important, and the general knows, is one of the reasons our military is the most powerful in the world is not just because of resources, not just because of great generals, but because we empower our junior leaders, our lieutenants, our sergeants, the folks that are on the ground making decisions, and that has really changed the way sort of our military has moved. Well, one of the things that I think the president understands is as a federal government, can't push these solutions down on communities. It takes those communities to help guide where we're going, and we can provide the support and technical guidance. And unfortunately, in a time of fiscal constraint, we can't just be providing money all over the place either. We've got to think about strategically how we provide our support. And so we think the best way to do that is through that technical resources that we have been able to fund over the course of the years to get the science, the toolkits, and other key things that local leaders are going to need to plan.
And John, I'd just like to echo what you and Warren both said on how the military trains younger leaders and bringing them up and how communities interact. Are we emulating to our youth in our communities, in our country, of what we want to emulate, or are they just looking in the mirror and seeing how we're treating each other? If we're going to come up with real solutions to real problems in our communities, we need to start emulating to that youth the right way to be resilient, sustainable, and how to be an owner, not just a renter, how to build capacity, which helps build property values, which brings people to your community and they spend sales tax dollars there.
That's that business case.
And that's that business case you were talking about, Warren, that makes you dateable as a community. On eharmonyeconomicdevelopment.com, you have to be a dateable community. If you're going to recover post-disaster, you have to do everything we're talking about prior so you're dateable. So you can have those public-private partnerships that come together and work together to make each one of our communities a better place for each of us to live and work. Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., the huge metropolitan areas are nothing more than small communities within a geographical boundary. And too many times we want to try to treat them as the big elephant in the room, and we can't handle it. And we all know the story. If you cut them up and eat it in small pieces, you can get it taken care of. We got to start being part of our communities, whether it's in an urban area or whether it's in a rural area. We can't allow state and federal government and even local government to dictate to us if we're not going to be willing to be involved in that process. If nothing irritates me more than to go to the coffee shop and they'll be holding a city council meeting at the coffee shop, and I mean that city council meeting. But nobody comes on every first and third Monday night to our city council meetings. If you really want to be informed, involved, and engaged, get in there and get it done. That's sustainability and that's resilience.
And on the political piece for a second, I think it's important to note, obviously Washington, not only are in the newspapers all the time, but, one of the reasons the President's Climate Action Plan is not as robust as our National Climate Action Plan should be, is because it's all authorities that he can take, not authorities Congress has given us to really change the game. Because Congress hasn't taken any significant steps on this issue in a long time. But specifically in the preparation piece, these are conversations that have to happen in a local community, which means that you all have to go and talk with your local leadership, both at the state and local level, but also at the national level, to explain to them why this is important for jobs in your community, and help educate them so that when they're looking at how to resource some of the programs that can be there to support you, that they're supporting those. When without that dialogue, if they just listen to what's happening in Washington, it's just two polarized sides that can't agree on whether or not this is even happening. So when you get into the preparation thing, it's something we can all agree on. But we have to have those conversations locally, and even with our national leaders locally.
And both of these folks are talking about building that business case for sustainability and resilience in our communities. Right. This is a mayor that gets it. I always say that if I go in and talk to a mayor, and he says, wait a minute, let me go get my emergency manager. I know it's going to be a hard slog. Not that there's anything wrong with emergency managers. They're absolutely vital. They also do what they do very, very well. They're probably the most prepared people. But if that mayor looks at me and says, wait a minute, let me go get my economic developer and bring him in, then we know we've got a mayor that's got it. He understands.
That's a great point. Boy, we sure love our mayors right now, don't we? Ben Barber has this great new book, What If Mayors Ruled the World? I think, we're, seriously. And, I think we're headed toward a world one day where a mayor maybe the mayor of Greensburg should run for president. These mayors, Mayor Fox, who's now the Secretary of Transportation, mayors that are now governors, like Governor Malloy and Governor Hickenlooper. These folks know how to get things done. And it reminds me of that great Mayor LaGuardia quote where he says, hey, look, there's no Democratic or Republican way of taking out the trash. You just get it done, because if you don't, you're out. So it is really about getting it done and doing it at the local level. So, Mayor, I want to turn to you again and ask, you've been out talking about your story and what you've been able to accomplish. What are you telling your peers? What are you telling other mayors as it relates to this issue? And I mean, you guys are not just a model of resilience, but you're a model of sustainability. You had soon after the disaster, you had a commitment to build your buildings to LEED Platinum, and that was an unbelievable commitment to make at the time. And now you guys are, like I said, a global model for resilience. Tell me what your engagement has been like with your peers and other mayors around the country.
Well, I think I'll get back to what Warren says. You've got to make a business case for all this. And when we talk in cities and municipalities, our budgets are based on property tax, sales tax, what we can control locally. We just can't go out and generate some money somewhere. Right. And those are the same people we have to see in the grocery store. Those are the same people we go to the hardware store and shop with. We have to think about the taxes that are being paid locally and the business case. So therefore, yes, you make yourself to where you're a destination spot. And then you have an opportunity as a community to do two things. You can be a surviving community or you can be a thriving community. You have to decide, are you going to be a thriving community or not? And then this all comes together, Jason, with what we're talking about. We have people that come and visit on the plains of western Kansas from all over the world in our living laboratory to see what's going on. That's economic development. That's money that hadn't had to be generated there of people coming in and spending dollars.
That's a great story.
And so that sustainability is what keeps going, and it's our awesome responsibility to share with other mayors, with other supervisors all over the United States what works and what doesn't work. Don't ever emulate what we did in Greensburg, Kansas and try to copy it. But know the process. The same process will work anywhere. Whether it's that aging sewer line that needs taken care of in towns, the aging infrastructure, whether it's a disaster, whether it's in your own personal private life disaster or business life, those same concepts and processes will work if you utilize them.
You mentioned a point that actually Warren kind of hammered into me early on, and it's a very intuitive point, but I thought it's a powerful point. Resilience is place-based. And this is, I think, a message that resonates with our green building community. We understand that there's so much of what we need to be resilient to is going to vary from community to community. And it gets to one of my other questions, because the language of sustainability has taken root. And I mean, everybody in this audience, I'm sure, is absolutely fluent in the language of sustainability. To gear up and to start to take off on resilience, we need to be fluent in the language of risk and vulnerability. How's that playing out in communities, Warren? I mean, is that you talked about simple tools and keeping it easy and things like that, but are we starting to get a better sense of the tools and the indicators and the best practices so folks can understand that? Or do we still need more people at the table? Do we need to bring in like the insurance community to help us navigate risk in a better way?
That's an interesting question, and one I'm not sure that I've thought a lot about. So I'll do the thing that I'm least capable of doing, and that's thinking in public. But I think the conversation has started, and I think that there's a growing understanding that we've got to do a better job of understanding and assessing risk. And that we need better tools to help mayors and business people in communities do that. But I would say that perhaps there are a couple of conversations we need to change. And I think that's at the federal government level. I think that's at the academic community level. It's at the practitioner level. We're spending an awful lot of time right now, and I hear colleagues and friends talk a lot about, I've just built something that people can use. I've just built something that this mayor can use. I've got a whole toolbox out there that people can use. Right. We've got to change the conversation a little bit and start building things that people will use. And that's a different conversation. And so there's lots of things out there in the toolbox that you can use, that I can use, that other mayors and business people can use. The problem is we've got to build those incentives that will cause them to actually use those, because tools that are brilliant tools that nobody takes out of the toolbox aren't very helpful to us. So I think there is a growing conversation around risk. I think there's a growing understanding of vulnerabilities. I think there's a growing realization that we've got to do something now so that we don't have to build a plan after the storm has come. But I think we really have to build that, and I'm going to go back to that business case that says, why would you use those tools? And start building things that people can use. Or will use.
I think that's an incredibly important point. So earlier this year, we had a workshop at the federal government level where we brought together the folks doing adaptation planning within the agencies, and many of them are operations folks, right? They're not climate folks, they're not sustainability folks, they're operation folks. And we brought together the science community that are developing a lot of these tools. In many cases, the science community has gone forward with developing what they think is needed versus what can be used, and oftentimes that doesn't translate very well. So we literally had a series of speed dating seminars where we brought together the science folks and the operations folks, work through the tools and find out how they can be tweaked so that the mayor in Kansas can go and pull this off and be able to utilize this. But I think you're absolutely right. This conversation has to continue to move towards what is not only needed, but what people want to be using to address these problems.
It's a great point. You know, I probably say it too often to my team, but it reminds me of the Field of Dreams. You know, if you build it, they will come. And I say, no. It's a question mark at the end. If you build it, will they come? Because there are a lot of tools and resources out there, but if they're not being used, they sit there getting dusty on the shelves. Listen, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to just rattle off a couple statistics as I set up my last question.
It wouldn't be a conference if you didn't have some stats.
That's right. Well, there's a lot of stats as it relates to this issue. For instance, in the last 2 years, disasters have cost our country $200 million in damages. In fact, let me make sure that's a billion. Sorry, I was about to say $200 billion in damage. In fact, the money the federal government had to spend in recovery in the last year is more than what the federal government spent on education, and more than what the federal government spent on infrastructure. That's an interesting stat because we're not anticipating the $50 billion that Congress authorized for recovery and rebuilding in Sandy. Those are dollars that we don't anticipate. And the other stats that I want to just make sure I got right, because I was talking to a lot of mayors about these issues now, and I've talked to the mayor of Hallandale Beach, and she had this story where her experience was 18 inches of rain in 18 hours. I talked to the mayor of El Paso, and he had 3 years worth of rain in 1 week. I mean, this extreme weather is upon us. The supervisor from Santa Barbara County was telling me about how he had to battle 4 major wildfires in 4 years. And again, these are just like your video. You know, usually these are 100-year events or these are 50-year events. Now they're 20, 10-year events. The mayor of Des Moines, a good friend of mine, Mayor County, was telling me about how he had the wettest year on record. It was the wettest year in 140 years. They had to go back 140 years to figure this out. So my point is that we're watching the Weather Channel like crazy. Every time we pick up the newspaper, we're seeing this on the front page. It's all around us, and sometimes it can wear on you. I mean, it's just tough. And I remember seeing a tweet recently saying, resilience is hard. And you said it already. This is tough. This is really tough. With that said, what encourages each of you, just in terms of a close? What makes you optimistic about the future and tackling this agenda? Because it's, we got a lot of work to do. What makes you optimistic? What makes you hopeful? And I don't know who wants to start.
I'll start, and maybe we can go down and end with the mayor, and I think you can see why he got elected. You're pretty inspiring, Mayor. I think that what inspires me, and I think in the current sort of national debate, to take it out of this issue for a second, the federal government, the federal employee, the federal worker has been sort of vilified recently, if you've been onto the news. What encourages me, though, is looking at the folks that I work with at the federal level who are doing work at the local level in cities all across this country, and it's inspiring, the innovation they're trying to drive. And so I really get inspired by the work they do. And one of the things, and I think all three of us have served at some level at the federal level, former Postal Service, both former military. There's an incredible group of young Iraq-Afghanistan veterans coming home from the war, inspired to get involved in energy security and climate security issues. We had an event at the White House just about 10 days ago to honor a few champions of change that are doing incredible work. But and I've sort of put a challenge back to this community, as you're looking to grow your businesses and to focus on some of these issues, some of the best workforce you're going to find are these returning vets, because they have developed the skills to lead, they have developed critical skills to operate. They may have to learn the sector a little bit, but they can do that quickly. They do it on the work they do. And there's a lot of great incentives out there to start to hire these returning veterans. Both the First Lady's got an initiative where she's got a series of companies who've already hired 235,000 vets and have committed to hiring over 400,000 more in the next few years. So we're happy to help. I'm happy to help connect you with folks that know those programs and know the tax incentives. But just think about that as you're beginning to grow your companies, because these are folks that can understand preparation, they understand resilience, and they can be a critical asset for you sort of going forward. And they inspire me every day.
That's great.
What gives me encouragement is resilience. The resilience conversation has started, and it started from the top to the bottom, and so we are now able to talk about this. It's become a mainstream conversation. We've got to make sure it doesn't become an irrelevant conversation, but it's become a mainstream conversation. And as been pointed out, it appears every place from the national security strategy of the United States down to plans that are being put in place by mayors. So the conversation is going, and it's a broad-based conversation. More importantly than that, I think there's a growing realization at the local level that we've got to fix this problem ourselves. One of the effects of paralysis in Washington is that more and more initiative and power is flowing down to local communities and mayors. And we see those mayors stepping up to that and realizing that if we're going to build a resilient America, we're going to found that on resilient American communities. We're not going to do it from the top down. We're going to do it from the bottom up. And I think as that realization grows and mayors find themselves more empowered and accept that empowerment, I think we're going to see a bottoms-up movement, and that I'm encouraged by that.
What really encourages me, and to give a little history about how I'm elected, it's totally nonpartisan. I go to the courthouse, which is a bastion of democracy in the United States. That's where you go to vote. That's where you get the privilege to get your property tax statement, and you pay your property taxes. Bastions of democracy. I run nonpartisan. I pay my $5 filing fee, and I'm on the ballot. The school board's the same way. The hospital board's the same way. And we need to get back where we're voting for people. We're not voting for R&D. I have my 9th grandchild that's 2 weeks old right now. That's encouragement.
Absolutely.
We're called to just be humble servants with a vision and a commitment to a brighter tomorrow. And we need to move boldly into the future with sustainability and resiliency, because I got 9 grandkids. that are way more important to me than $200 billion that quote the federal government. The federal government, you spent $200 billion on disaster. We all spent that on it. There is no such thing as quote the federal government. It's us. So as we get down to drive this down to the localest level we can of implementation, you have buy-in, you have investment, you have vision, and you have commitment to making it work. That's sustainability and that's resilience.
Absolutely.
I'll vote for him.
Yeah, seriously.
Well, I'm optimistic because of their leadership. So that concludes our session. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank our speakers. Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jay.